Welcome everyone to the 2010 Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order talk. It's a mouthful, our award. A couple of words, general announcement before I introduce our speaker tonight. First, like everyone, if you have a device, anything similar to this, to please at least put it on vibrate or off, a bit better, something like that. I'd also like to recognize a few people in the audience. We have, see, one's going off right now. Where did Al go? The director of the overseer of all the Grawemeyer Awards, Al Dittmer, is in the middle of the audience. He helped make the decision that determined tonight's award and all the others. Also, my assistant, Arlene Brannon, you probably met at the door with the flyer. I can't do this award without Arlene. She keeps threatening to retire, and I keep threatening to resign. So, those will be linked events. Look for that in the future. And we have some members of Charles Grawemeyer's family. Of course, Mr. Grawemeyer was the donor that made all of this possible, and we're very thankful to the family. Appreciate their coming. They even now have the same restaurants they go to when they come. So it's a ritual, and we're very happy for it. And I'm very pleased tonight to be introducing our winner. I won't talk very long because all of you received a short copy of his biography. I would note, however, as we were walking in tonight, his claim to have grown up in Sweden and to have worked for the Swedish government is authentic because he translated Ekstrom for me. I guess that is the Swedish word. He said oak stream. So, I've been here 19 years at UofL. Now I know what Ekstrom means. But Dr. Parsi received his PhD from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. And he's one of the co-founders of the National Iranian American Council. And that is well, in my foreign policy class, we just talked about interest groups, and I think it's fair to say an interest group, and he's going to talk not only probably about these ideas, but some of the things in terms of foreign policy that will be defined as interests. It is interesting to have Dr. Parsi this year because his book has received a lot of attention, and it's been generally favorably received. For example, it won a runner-up prize, a named prize from the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a very traditional, I hesitate to use the word stodgy, but I will say mainstream foreign policy organization in New York, right? I've heard of the Council on Foreign Relations, right? It's a fairly big deal. Yet, and in part, I think that reflects the fact that this book, and I don't want to talk too much about it and use up too much of your time, but this book is inspired by political realism, which I tell my students is a very traditional, mainstream, analytical tool for thinking about international politics. It talks about interests and power and competition, the things that political scientists are interested in. And international politics, it's seen as a relatively conservative and mainstream view. Yet, interestingly, in Washington, and this may be one of those things only in Washington, the book has been attacked by conservatives. He's going to talk, I think, a little bit about a particular subset of conservatives that have been attacked. The tradition flows from people like Machiavelli and Hobbes, that life is nasty, brutish, and short, right? That's the tradition inspiring this work, and thankfully the ideas here were not short term. It's a provocative thesis, and I'm going to let him outline it and explain perhaps why it's been attacked and perhaps what his defense is. And we selected it, I think, primarily, and I had administrative control over that more than, although I read the book, but I wasn't. We have a step-by-step process where we send books out for external review, and then we winnow to a small collection based on the ones that have outstanding reviews, and then a panel of outside scholars and policymakers read those and make a shorter list and some recommendations, and then a community group with some people from the university make the final selection. So it's a very rigorous process to win this award, and I think primarily because of the prominence of the Iran question in current international politics, that's why we awarded this book. And it's important to think that this book proves that there are ideas that aren't dominating the discussion of Washington that are certainly worth thinking about.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure being here back at University of Louisville. I've actually been here twice before. Both of the times had nothing to do with the Derby. We actually had something to do with the university. And in good realist tradition, I'll try to keep my talk nasty, brutish, and short. But I do want to talk to you about what is happening in the Middle East today and talk to you about the many, many difficulties that the United States and, of course, all the different countries in the region face. And I want to start off with a history, because this book is very much about understanding the balance between ideology and strategic motivations behind foreign policy, which is absolutely critical at this point of time. So let me start off by giving you a quote. The quote is, "Iran is Israel's best friend, and we do not intend to change our position in relation to Tehran." The quote is from an Israeli prime minister, but it's not Ben-Gurion in the 60s or Golda Meir in the 70s. It's actually Yitzhak Rabin. The year is 1987. Ayatollah Khomeini is still alive, and he's still calling Israel a cancerous tumor that needs to be removed. Yet, Rabin referred to Iran as a strategic ally. I wanted to start off with that quote to show the complexity of the Israeli-Iranian relationship and the impact that it currently continues to have on the United States. It's a perplexity that oftentimes is lost on us when our focus is too excessively on the rhetoric and on the ideological components of this. Now, of course, when you have Ahmadinejad, who in my view is not the president of Iran, making outlandish comments about Israel, and of course you have the rhetoric from the Israeli side about potentially attacking Iran, it's not wise to completely set aside rhetoric. But when we focus on it too much at the expense of other factors, then we risk becoming blinded by it and miss out many of the other dynamics that are at play. And in this specific case, that is the geostrategic driving forces of the rivalry that currently exists between these countries. Now, why did Rabin say this? Well, because already since the inception of the Jewish state, Ben-Gurion devised only years afterwards a security doctrine that was called the doctrine of the periphery. The idea that Israel's security was best achieved by allying itself with the powers in the periphery, the non-Arab powers in the periphery of the Middle East, in order to balance the Arab powers in Israel's vicinity. And the most important periphery power was, of course, Iran. There was also Turkey, Ethiopia, but Iran was a major Muslim power with access to a lot of energy, and as a result, a state that meant could be of a tremendous value to the Jewish state. And the two factors that caused the Iranians to also reciprocate this relationship was the fact that both Iran and Israel faced common threats. Both of them sensed the threat from the Soviet Union and Soviet penetration of the Middle East. And both of them sensed a significant threat from pan-Arab nationalist states, particularly Iraq under Saddam and Egypt under Nasser. These two factors brought the two countries closer together. They developed a very, very strong security relationship that for most of the time was kept behind the scenes. Particularly from the Iranian perspective, they wanted to keep this as quiet as possible. The Israelis wanted this to be out in the open because it made sense for Israel to show that in its very early stages of its life, it actually had managed to develop really constructive and close relations with a major Jewish state. But from the Iranian perspective, they wanted to keep this quiet, thinking that if they gave too much attention to it, Iran would unnecessarily attract Arab anger that otherwise would have been directed at Israel itself. And the Iranians went to great lengths trying to keep this a secret. They built a special tarmac at Tehran airport, far away from the central terminal, in which only the Israeli airplanes could land, so that no one would notice the very large number of Israeli airplanes that tended to land in Tehran. When the Israeli Prime Minister visited Iran, which was actually quite frequently, the protocol that emerged and developed was one in which the plane would land around 2 a.m. in the morning. And the Shah actually usually met with them alone. The foreign minister usually didn't find out about the Israeli visit until 2 days after it had taken place. And Yitzhak Rabin even wore a wig when he went to Iran as a defense minister in the mid-1970s, just to make sure that no one would be able to recognize him. And this continued throughout the 1970s, and the alliance between them was very, very strong. Of course, it was an open secret that they had this alliance, but the Iranians kept on playing the charade. The Israelis played along because the substance of the relationship was more important than the formalities. Now, there's a perception that all of this changes in 1979 because of the Islamic Revolution, because you had then a new government take power in Iran, a very religious, fundamentalist government with a very, very strong anti-Israeli ideology. And there's no doubt that that, of course, is true. The ideology of this new state, of this new government, was vehemently anti-Israeli. But from the Israeli perspective, it was very critical to see if they could retain the relationship with Iran in spite of the new government, because Iran was just too important as a periphery power to lose. And Israel had actually managed only 5 years earlier to retain its relationship with a periphery power, Ethiopia, even though that country underwent a regime change and switched camps in the Cold War. The effort now was to do the same thing with Iran. And Israel had many different cards to play. The first and the most important one was, of course, that Iran's entire military was built on American weaponry, which meant that the Iranians could not operate their defenses absent access to American spare parts. And particularly once the war broke out between Iran and Iraq, that was, of course, a very critical question for Iran. Due to the American embargo on spare parts in Iran, which President Carter put into place as a result of the hostage crisis, there were essentially only two countries in the world that had access and willingness to sell these spare parts to the Iranians. One was North Vietnam, that happened to have a lot of spare parts for a completely different reason. And the other one was Israel. And very early on, the Israelis used that connection to show their strategic utility to the Iranians, because from their strategic outlook, it made perfect sense. It would be a disaster for the Israelis if Iran would have lost the war against Iraq. Now, note, though, that the relationship, the outreach from the Israelis actually started long before the war. But once the war started, this became astute. You had only 4 days after the outbreak of war in September 1980, the Israeli Deputy Defense Minister holding a press conference in Vienna, urging the United States to put the past behind it in order to keep up Iran's defenses. The fear was that if Iraq were to defeat Iran, Iraq would become a tremendously powerful state, and for the first time, Iraq's Arab army might join an Arab coalition against Israel, something that never had happened before in the previous wars that Israel fought against the Arabs. So the Israeli position was that in spite of the fact that when that press conference was held, 52 American diplomats were held hostages in Iran, the strategic calculation was that it was a necessity for Israel to use its connections to retain that relationship with Iran in spite of the new government there, and help Iran bridge its differences with the United States. From the Iranian perspective, it was a little bit more complicated. On the one hand, there was now an ideological imperative for the Iranians to oppose Israel, which had less to do with Israel than it had to do with Iran. Iran is a country that for a very long time have had ingrained in its DNA, in its identity, that it is and has to be a major leader in the region. And to be a major leader in the region, when you are a majority Persian, a majority Shiite state, and the region is majority Sunni, majority Arab, and you have had centuries of conflicts between Sunnis and Shiites, and between Arabs and Persians, the Iranians calculated that in order for them to be able to beef up their leadership credentials, they needed to find a way to bridge the Persian-Arab rift, to bridge the Sunni-Shiite rift. And the answer was political Islam, and the answer was anti-Israeli rhetoric. The more Iran presented itself as being on the vanguard of defending the Palestinians, the more it could, in its calculation, overcome any tensions that existed between the Arabs and the Iranians, and beef up its credentials to be seen as the leader of the region. But at the same time, whereas it had this ideological, political incentive to do this. He also had an immediate security interest in retaining that relationship with Israel, because otherwise it would risk losing the war against Iraq. Now, the Iranian solution to this dilemma was essentially to try to have its cake and eat it too. The Iranians adopted a rhetoric that was inflammatory and venomous against the Jewish state. And behind the scenes, they continued to deal with Israel exactly in the way that they had done prior to the revolution. Continue to buy arms from them, continue to collaborate on security matters, to a lesser extent than before, but nevertheless they continued. And oftentimes, the rhetoric and the intensity of the rhetoric was directly proportional and used to be able to cover up the fact that behind the scene, Iran was still dealing with the Israelis. So oftentimes when it intensified its deals with the Israelis, it also intensified its anti-Israeli rhetoric in order for no one to bring attention to the fact that Iran was playing a very obvious double game. And this continued throughout the 1980s, and it culminated in the Iran-Contra scandal, which I'm sure many people in this room remember, an Israeli initiative in which the Israelis were seeking to convince the United States that Iran needed to be brought back into the Western fold, and that the United States needed to sell arms to the Iranians in order to ensure that Iran would not lose the war against Iraq. This is at a time when America's interest and Israel's interest vis-à-vis Iran and Iraq diverged quite extensively, because since 1983, the United States had become more or less an explicit supporter of Saddam Hussein after the visit of Donald Rumsfeld in Baghdad. In 1986, Shimon Peres, who was very deeply involved in the effort of rebuilding U.S.-Iranian relations in order to defeat Saddam, wrote a letter to President Reagan in which he urged the president to overcome the difficulties in Lebanon, by which he meant the hostages, the American hostages held by Hezbollah, in order to bring Iran back into a larger strategic relationship with the West. The issue, the time, and the developments that really change the relationship between Iran and Israel and brings us to the dynamic that we have today is not the developments in 1979, because at the end of the day, whereas Iran changes its regime and adopts a much more hostile ideology, the geostrategic context had not changed. Iran still felt a threat from the Arab states, as did Israel. Iran still felt a threat from the Soviet Union, as did Israel. And Iran had actually, in a strange manner, through its own radicalism, now managed to also turn the United States into an enemy, the only other superpower. So Iran was paradoxically in greater need of Israel after the revolution than it was before. All of this, though, changes in the period of 1991 to 1993, because that's when you have the collapse of the Soviet Union, and second, the defeat of Iraq, the last standing Arab army that could pose a conventional military threat to both Iran and to Israel, was defeated by the United States and the UN coalition. And suddenly, the two factors that had brought Iran and Israel closer together throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, in spite of Iran's new ideology, were gone. And a new geostrategic environment opened up in the region, one in which Iran and Israel emerged as two of the most powerful states, but no buffer in between them to be able to protect them from each other. Just as much as Iran was needed to balance Iraq from the Israeli perspective, to a certain extent, Iraq was also needed to balance Iran. But there was no longer such an Iraq that could fulfill that function. Now you had a completely new situation. And every time you have a geostrategic shock to a region, you find countries finding themselves in situations in which either they have an opportunity to redefine their roles, or they have a challenge to redefine their roles. But redefining the roles they have to do. And in the case of Iran, it turned out to be an opportunity. The Iranians had failed miserably with their revolution. This was a revolution that was supposed to make Iran a leader, but in reality, Iran was now war-torn, it was impoverished, It had become more isolated than before, and it was clear to the Iranians that they needed to be able to repatch the relationship with the West in order to attract investments and other things in order to be able to come out of its isolation. And the war against Saddam Hussein in 1991 provided the Iranians with that opportunity. They could now show America their strategic utility by adopting a position that they called positive neutrality. The Iranians essentially permitted the United States to use Iranian airspace against Saddam Hussein. They opened up a channel of communication with Washington. For the first time, there was a set authoritative channel of communication. And perhaps most importantly, after the war, when the Shiites in the southern regions of Iraq rose up against Saddam Hussein, the Iranians resisted the temptation of coming to the aid of their religious brethren, a move that at the time helped prevent Iraq deteriorating into an open civil war and also helped ensure the continuation of Iraq's geographic integrity. Something that was deeply appreciated by the Bush senior administration, to the extent that Secretary of State at the time at one point said that after the war, a new security order is needed in the region, one that includes Iran. That was music to the ears of the Iranian rulers. This was their opportunity to be able to come in from the cold, after having isolated themselves essentially through their radicalism. For Israel, however, this was far more of a challenge than an opportunity. Israel played a critical strategic role for the United States during the Cold War as a bulwark against Soviet penetration in the region. But there was no longer a Soviet Union for Israel to play that role against any longer. And particularly the run-up to the Persian Gulf War really showed the Israelis the tremendous challenge that they faced. The Bush senior administration went to great lengths to put together a real international coalition against Saddam Hussein. And part of the coalition needed to be, in their calculation, Arab states, in order to show that this was not the Western assault against a Muslim state. This was truly an international coalition against an aggressor. So the Arabs needed to be included. But for the Arabs to be included, the Arabs essentially requested two things of the United States. For the Arabs to be included, Israel needed to be kept out. The Arabs could stomach fighting another Arab power alongside the United States. They could not stomach fighting another Arab power alongside the United States and Israel. So they needed to keep the Israelis out, and that's part of the reason why Saddam Hussein, who fully understood this, decided to, unprovoked, attack Israel with 34 Scud missiles in the hope that the Israelis would retaliate. And as soon as Israel would retaliate, the Arab coalition would walk out. And the entire coalition, to a large extent, could have fallen apart. Israel resisted the temptation. It was a terribly difficult decision for Yitzhak Shamir at the time to make. It went completely against Israeli security doctrine, in which it said that Israel would never permit itself to be attacked without retaliating. But this is something the Israelis did under American pressure, but it was also meant to be a gesture towards the United States. The second promise that the United States had to give to the Arabs was that if the Arabs are going to help the United States against Iraqi occupation of Kuwait, then after the war, the United States needed to address Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory. And that promise was given. Pressure would be put on Israel to vacate and address the settlement issue. And this was to happen through a conference. And that's exactly what happened. You had the Madrid conference a couple of months after the Persian Gulf War. But both of these developments were quite concerning to Israel at the time, because it showed to the Israelis that Israel was increasingly being treated not as an asset in the region, but rather as a burden. And there was a fear in Israel that if the United States was now gravitating towards the Arab position, and in addition to that, would have a rapprochement with Iran, where would that leave Israel strategically in the perspective of the United States? When the strategic utility of Israel as a bulwark against the Soviet Union also, in addition, was no longer there. In 1992, when the Israelis went to election they elected the Labour Party, and for the first time Labour could rule without having a coalition with the Likud, enabling Labour to do significant changes to Israel's security doctrine, which was not possible if they had a much smaller majority. And the decision was a very clever one, realizing that the geostrategic situation had changed, that the real threat in their assessment was no longer from the Arab vicinity, but rather from the Persian periphery. A complete shift in Israel's approach was needed. One in which the argument was, in order to be able to regain strategic prominence in Washington, Israel needed to do things that Washington would find helpful, such as making peace with the Arab states, neutralizing those borders, but be able to shift the focus towards Iran and also build a new geopolitical order in which Israel would be put at the center as a producer for a 250 million market. This was part of a vision that Shimon Peres had, his vision for peace. It made a lot of strategic sense because it adjusted itself not only to the new geopolitical realities in which there was no real conventional military threat to Israel, and in addition to that, there was a tremendous fatigue with the Intifada and the difficulties that existed between Israel and its Arab neighbors at the time. This, however, went completely against what the Iranians had in mind. The Iranians were hoping that as a result of having aided the United States, at least in a limited way in the Iraq War, they had now their opportunity to be brought back in from the cold and be part of the security environment. That did not happen, because instead the United States opted for the peace process and the dual containment policy, the idea that the region would be safest if the United States isolated Iraq and Iran. And this is the time in which, for the first time, the Iranians and the Israelis begin to undermine U.S. policy initiatives in the region that they deemed beneficial to the other, in which they started to view each other as direct rivals. Anything that was good for the one of them would automatically be viewed as negative for the other. The Iranian calculation was that this was an effort by the United States to create an entire new order in the region based on Israel's centrality and Iran's long-term isolation. And the weakest link in that strategy, from the Iranian perspective, was the peace process. If the peace process was undermined and if it failed, none of the other objectives of the United States and Israel could be reached. Strategic objectives of the United States and Israel could be reached in the calculations of the Iranians. And according to Martin Indyk, who at the time was serving as an important person in the U.S. National Security Council, the Iranian calculation wasn't necessarily incorrect, because as he said it, and I quote him, the Iranians had every incentive to oppose the peace process. The more we succeeded in making peace, the more isolated Iran would become. The more we succeeded in containing Iran, the more possible it would be to make peace. So they had an incentive to do us in on the peace process in order to defeat our policy of containment. On the other hand, from the Israeli perspective, there was a fear that if the United States began talking to Iran, and if the United States actually had a rapprochement with Iran, a rapprochement would come at the expense of Israeli security interest. And that's why in 1992, for the first time, 13 years after the revolution, you had Israelis coming to the United States and talking about an Iranian threat, and denying the very idea that there could be elements in Iran that could be more moderate. And this was very odd at first, and it took Washington by surprise, because this message was carried by the very same people, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, who only 5 years earlier, in the Iran-Contra scandal, was telling the United States to talk to Iran, sell arms to Iran, and not pay attention to Iranian rhetoric, because the rhetoric was not reflective of the real policy anyways. It took about 2 years before this message stuck in Washington, but by the time it did, you had a new dynamic in which the Iranians were doing everything they could to undermine the United States, and the Israelis were doing everything they could to undermine any effort to bring any rapprochement between the United States and Iran. That dynamic has continued till this day, but there has not been any shortage of outreach from either side to the other. Benjamin Netanyahu in 1996 actually did go to great lengths trying to find a way to talk to the Iranians. But he was not successful because the Rafsanjani government did not want any dialogue with the Israelis at the time. President Clinton did extensive outreach to the Iranians, and including lifting some of the sanctions and giving a semi-apology for the 1953 coup against Iran's first democratically elected prime minister. But political infighting in Iran made it impossible for the Iranians to respond in kind. The most interesting, though, point of outreach probably came in the year 2003. In May of that year, only 2 weeks after the United States took Baghdad, the Iranians sent a proposal for comprehensive negotiations to the United States via the Swiss ambassador in Tehran, who had been tasked since 1991 to be the authoritative channel of communication between the two states. The proposal came in, and it was comprehensive with the exception of not including anything about human rights in Iran. But beyond that, it addressed almost every issue that stood between the United States and Iran. If the negotiations had been pursued and if they had been successful, theoretically what had been on the table at the time was a complete opening of Iran's nuclear program and full transparency. This is at a time when the Iranians probably only had 50 centrifuges. Collaboration against all terrorist groups in the region, above all Al-Qaeda. Collaboration in Iraq in order to ensure that the new government there would not be a sectarian government. And perhaps most surprisingly, pressure on Islamic Jihad and Hamas to cease using violence against Israel. Turning Hezbollah into a mere political organization, which essentially means disarming them. And signing on to the Beirut Declaration, the Saudi peace plan, the idea that the entire Muslim world, or Arab world first, would recognize Israel in return for an Israeli recognition of a Palestinian state. In return, the Iranians wanted lifting of sanctions, a strategic dialogue, and recognition of Iran's defense interests in the region. The proposal came in. I got a chance to see it because I worked in Congress at the time, and the Swiss ambassador gave a copy to my former congressman, who sent it off to the White House to Karl Rove. They had a conversation for about 5 minutes about the proposal. He found it intriguing and promised to put it on the president's desk. That's the last we heard of it, until about 4 months later, an article in the Financial Times by Guy Dinmore saying that there had been some form of peace offer, peace proposal, sent to the White House by the Iranians through the Swiss, and the White House's response at the time was to reprimand the Swiss ambassador for having delivered it in the first place. This was during the time in which more hardline elements in the White House felt that whatever could be achieved through negotiations, even more could be achieved by simply removing the government in Iran. This is at a time when regime change was a very favorable word, a very fashionable word in Washington. What happened, of course, was that 4 months later you had the outbreak of the insurgency in Iraq, and rather soon the tables started to switch, to turn, and Iran found itself increasingly in a comfortable and strong position, and the United States increasingly dealt with significant difficulties in Iraq, weakening its ability to put pressure on Iran. Now, some would argue that this is all spilled milk, this is ancient history, it's almost a decade ago, and that it has no bearing on reality today. But I think it does. First of all, if you take a look at the history of Iran and Israel, and how the relationships have changed and not changed, you see that none of the major shifts in the relationships coincide with any ideological shift in either one of the countries. If ideology was the driving force of this conflict, then we would have expected a much more intense enmity between Iran and Israel and its impact on the United States in the 1980s, when Iran's ideological zeal was at its height. If ideology was the driving force of this conflict, we would have expected to see a weakening of that enmity, a softening of the enmity, perhaps something even positive, in the 1990s, when Iran's ideological zeal was at its low until it had taken a deep hit. Instead, we see the opposite. In the 1980s, they continued to collaborate behind the scenes. And in the 1990s, when the ideology is much less of a factor, their rivalry turns into something much, much more intense and much more bloody. These shifts do not coincide with ideological shifts. They coincide with geostrategic shifts in the region. And that's incidentally good news, because if this was an ideological battle, then there would be no such thing as a draw. It would inevitably lead to the victory of one over the other in a major confrontation. But when it is actually of a strategic nature, you do have opportunities. Opportunities to be able to negotiate, opportunities to be able to find solutions, perhaps even win-win solutions. You can expand the pie when the conflict is of strategic nature. And this is important because today you have those who say that it is 1938 and Iran is Germany, and Ahmadinejad, a person that I find quite despicable, particularly mindful of what he did this past summer, that he is Hitler. Now, if we accept the premise of this analogy, that indeed it is 1938, Iran is Germany, and Ahmadinejad is Hitler, the question is, who will like to play the role of Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister who thought that he could negotiate? This is an analogy that essentially is designed to eliminate diplomacy and engagement from the table. And if you eliminate diplomacy, you make war inevitable. But if we take a more close study of this relationship, if we look beyond the rhetoric and the ideology, we find what I would consider to be the true driving forces of this conflict, and we can see opportunities that we otherwise would overlook by the very first assumption that we made about this conflict. Now, mindful of what has happened in the past couple of months with the Obama administration's effort to engage, to negotiate, and I think they went to great lengths trying to find a resolution through diplomacy with Iran, it is clear that this is not in any way, shape, or form an easy task, nor can we ever have the expectation that there is a guarantee for success. But if we also take a look at what happened in these last couple of months, we would also come to the conclusion, I believe, that there is absolutely very little to support the idea that this in any way, shape, or form was an exhaustion of diplomacy. The Obama administration did, in my view, a tremendous job in changing the atmosphere between the United States and Iran through the work that they did in the first 6 months. And they were eager to be able to get to the table because the nuclear clock was ticking. But they probably expected that by the end of June 12th, there would be an election result in Iran, and there would be a new government in Iran, and they could pursue diplomacy. What they didn't expect was that there would be this massive fraud. I'm not going to go deeply into the evidence or circumstantial evidence as to why there was fraud, but let me just mention a couple of things. If this was a just election, it's very difficult to see why it would be necessary for the Iranian government to close off the Interior Ministry on the same night as the election night and not permit people who worked in the Interior Ministry, who are supposed to count the votes, get into the building. If this was not a fraud election, it's very difficult to understand how the Iranians managed to count 40 million handwritten ballots in less than 2.5 hours. If they're that good, we should hire them for Florida every 4 years. If this was not a fraudulent election, then it's difficult to understand why the arrest warrants for the reformist and other candidates who were arrested the very same night as the elections had been issued a week before the elections. But the election fraud, nevertheless, created political chaos inside of Iran. And by the time negotiations started in October of 2009, it was unclear as to whether this government would be able to negotiate. And by the end of that month, I think more and more people in Washington and in the White House came to the conclusion that the Iranians were too much at each other's throat. They had too intense of a political conflict internally to be able to come to a consensus on what to do on this issue. And I think the conclusion till this day in Washington is that they have to, in some formal way, wait it out because it's too difficult. The most important variable for the success of any negotiations is not under the control of the United States, even though it is a superpower, and that is the internal situation in Iran. But if another opportunity for diplomacy were to emerge in the next year or so, then I think there's a couple of things that we can conclude would be better to do in the next round of negotiations in order to ensure a higher success rate. The first issue is the negotiations in October last year were extremely narrow. The only focus was the nuclear issue. The only attempt was to make sure that an agreement was found on the Tehran research reactor in order to ship out the low-enriched uranium that existed in Iran. There was no talk or no significant talk about human rights in Iran. There was no talk about Afghanistan or Iraq. Essentially, we created only one channel for the negotiations. And when that channel did not end up successfully reaching an agreement, the entire diplomacy engagement policy fell apart. If we had put our eggs in more than one basket and did bring up human rights in Iran, did bring up the situation in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other matters, then failure or problems in one channel could be compensated by success in another channel. Secondly, the issue of timetables. We had pursued sanctions on Iran for about 20 years. We gave diplomacy 12 weeks. And we did so by only having one channel. I think in the future, whereas no one, of course, would argue for completely open-ended negotiations, we know, based on our own experience in the Middle East, that there's very little that is achieved in the Middle East in 12 weeks. Forget about achieving peace in 12 weeks. So we have to have realistic expectations and timeframes. And last but not least, if we do confidence-building measures, as was the case with the Tehran research reactor. The idea was we ship out the Iranian LEU, we give them back fuel rods 9 months later. This reduces their stockpile, reduces their breakout capability. We have one more year in which we have less of a nuclear ticking clock above our heads, and it does a lot to be able to establish more trust on which further negotiations could be built on. But the point with a confidence-building measure is that you cannot turn it into a precondition. We turned a tactical nuclear confidence-building measure into a strategic end in and of itself. If we didn't manage to successfully agree to it, we didn't do anything else. 8 more weeks that was supposed to be used for diplomacy went by without any other effort for any other type of a confidence-building measure. Confidence-building measures are such that if you try one, if it doesn't work, you try something else. But what ended up in this situation, which I believe, again, was deeply influenced by the fact that Iran was in such political chaos that there was very little confidence that the Iranians could respond to anything, was that we didn't try anything at all. If we are lucky and there is another window for negotiations, then my hope would be that we would address those issues, and we certainly would take a long view of Iran. And a long view of Iran means that you cannot make a short-term security deal at the expense of the human rights situation in Iran, because that will only end up backfiring on the United States. We would have yet another state in the region in which we have good relations with the government, but bad relations with the people. Thank you so much.
We have time for questions. I think that you can probably handle most of them himself, but I want to keep in mind that we are asking questions and not having a debate per se, meaning that it'd be great if you could, keep your questions as concise as possible rather than in speech form, and then let them reply. Hopefully the provocative ideas will suffice for that. I'm not trying to shut anybody down, but most of us came to hear Dr. Parsi speak. Do you want to just follow people?
Sure,
I can do it.
I can do it.
Okay.
Why did you say that Ahmadinejad is not the real president of Iran?
Because I think there's too much circumstances that show that there's strong indications that this election was not a fair one, that he did not win with the 62.9% that he claims that he has won the elections with. And we have seen that even if, perhaps, for the sake of argument, there wasn't as much of a fraud, there nevertheless is no question whatsoever about the human rights abuses that took place in Iran in front of the world's eyes to see in the aftermath of the elections, in which people were beaten up, killed, tortured, in jail, raped in jail, killed in jail, and this unfortunately is continuing till this day. It's very rare that after a landslide victory of 62.9% you have to resort to those type of excesses.
You place great emphasis on strategic interests and an effort to say that ideology is not irrelevant, but not But isn't that for the strategic interests, aren't they playing fire in the sense that ideology is contagious and difficult to keep under control? And in particular, what's the mechanism that, I mean, do you posit a political class that has enough power to manage ideology, that they play puppet master here and keep things within boundaries?
No, you raise a very, very interesting point, and I think it's the point that should be put to them. Because you're right, this is contagious, this is very, very dangerous, but there is a very strange common interest between hardline elements in Iran and hardline elements in Israel, in which both of them prefer an ideological framing and understanding of this conflict because of their strategic calculation that that framing is beneficial to them. From the Israeli side, if this conflict is viewed not as a strategic one, this is not about Israeli hegemonic aspirations or anything of that kind, but rather about the sole Western liberal democracy in the region up against a dictatorial, authoritative, theological government from the Middle Ages. If that is the framing, how difficult is it then to conclude what the allegiances of most Western countries will be? It becomes rather automatic. If, from the Iranian perspective, they frame this as part of their power struggle to be able to gain a strong position in the region and play a leadership role, this is all about Iran's nationalistic aspirations, how attractive would that be for the larger Muslim world? Compare that framing to a framing in which they say this has actually nothing to do with Iran. This is Iran sacrificing its own interest at the behest and for the sake of the rights of the Palestinians, the dignity of Islam, and standing up for the Islamic world. Suddenly you have a framing in which they can draw resources to themselves from the entire Muslim world. And they have used it extensively for that. That's part of the reason that after all of the venomous rhetoric of Ahmadinejad, he is one of the most popular people in the region outside of Iran. In most of the Arab world, they tend to be idolizing him, whereas in Iran, it's quite the opposite. But it is something that the Iranians have achieved with their ideology. And here's one thing that is really dangerous. Every side is playing to their own theater, to their own constituency, with almost zero consideration to what their rhetoric does to other constituencies. People often ask, well, don't they understand how negatively it is perceived here, how angry people become, how negatively they view them when Ahmadinejad goes and starts questioning the Holocaust? The question is not if they understand, the question is if they care. And look at around it from the other side. In the midst of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, or at least, well, there was an invasion after a couple of days in 2006, you had Secretary of State Condi Rice at one point in the Middle East explain what was happening by saying that these are the birth pangs of a new Middle East. Now, how do you think that was perceived in the Middle East? It doesn't seem like she had that audience in mind. We're constantly speaking to our own audiences, which then reinforces this ideological framing. An ideological framing that if we accept it, if we depart from it in our decisions, we will make conflict inevitable.
You mentioned the internal conflict in Iran. Could you speak a little bit more to that in terms of the various constituencies, the military, and the religious establishment, and are we in a position to, how much of a position are we in to know who's in charge of what? You get the gist of that question.
We've rarely known with any specific accuracy how decisions are made in Iran or who is in charge and where different people stand. It's always been a little bit of a mystery, and deliberately so. The Iranians have pursued a policy that they call simulated irrationality, in which they want to have as opaque of a system as possible, calculating that if the outside world doesn't know and understand how decisions are made, it will make the outside world more cautious and win Iran time and security. It's a disastrous decision in the long run, of course, because it just means that mistrust is perpetuated. But if there ever was a time in which we really didn't know who was making the shots, who's calling the shots, who's making the decisions, it's right now. And I think right now very few people in Iran would know who is the real decision maker. They are going through the biggest political upheaval that this regime ever has experienced. And whatever is true today, it's a very dynamic situation, whatever is true today as to who is calling the shots, it may not be true a month from now. Look what happened at the end of December of last year. You had massive demonstrations on the day of Ashura, and there was a lot that indicated that the Green Movement was really moving forward full speed. A month and a half later, you had the celebrations of the revolution. Some people from the outside had raised the expectations to the extent that people thought that this was going to be some sort of a final battle, part 3 in the Lord of the Rings, but ended up being nothing of the kind. And now we're going back to a situation in which it's very difficult to assess what the balance of power is. But based on my own interviews with people there, I would give you this conclusion, this more generalized conclusion, that the people that have been on the way out ever since 2002, and what happened in January 2002 was this. A couple of months earlier, the United States was attacked by the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The Iranians had already been at war with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban for 9 years. A massive collaboration took place between the United States and Iran in order to defeat the Taliban. The Iranians thought that this was going to be something that would really pave the way for a better relationship. This was all done during the reformist president. According to Jim Dobbins, who was President Bush's representative and who led these talks, the Iranian support, particularly the intelligence as well as political support, was instrumental for achieving what the United States achieved in Afghanistan. And this culminated in the December 10th Bonn conference, in which a new constitution was put in place for Afghanistan. 6 weeks later, George Bush put Iran in the axis of evil. And since then, you've had a process in which those in Iran who were arguing that collaboration with the United States was beneficial to Iran, there was a way to open up those talks, there was justification for giving concessions and collaborate with the United States even though no price was asked for it up front, that they gradually became weakened, and this culminated then with the election of Ahmadinejad and the stolen election 4 years later. So now you have a crowd there whose calculations seem to be that you don't deal with the United States by making peace offers or collaborating. You deal with the United States by making it as costly as possible for the United States not to agree to your demands and objectives. Essentially what you have is the equivalent of a neoconservative world outlook that has taken over in Iran and become much, much stronger. I think I saw someone.
What do you think is the probability that Israel will attack Iran to destroy the nuclear facilities, and what would be the result?
Let me start off with the second part of the question. What will be the result of that? According to an Israeli study that was published by the University of Tel Aviv, I think it was a very good study. It showed that the idea that this in any way, shape, or form could be a short war is mistaken. Looking at how Iran fought the Iraq-Iran war, the comparative strength that Iran has compared to Israel, for instance, is that Iran already has in the past and will continue to be able to sustain a lot of damage and remain determined in such a war. They did so during the Iraq-Iran war. Whereas Israel, for instance, would have a great difficulty sustaining 6 months of rocket attacks, terrorist acts inside of the country. We already saw that in the Lebanese war. After 34 days, the Israelis essentially settled for a draw, even though Israel is vastly superior to Iran in military terms. But the Iranians will most likely play the asymmetric game and play the sustainability game, the tenacity game. Who can be more determined in such a fight? And this would be something that from the Israeli perspective would be quite disastrous, because it would be very difficult to completely knock out Iran, and Iran will continue to have the capability of creating tremendous problems in Iran and deprive the Israeli society of any sense of normality. An Israeli state that already is fighting a demographic war, that is already having problems with too many people leaving the country because of a sense of lack of security, would not be able to sustain such a situation. What would happen in Iran? Well, one of the first things that would happen with some certainty is to say that the pro-democracy movement in Iran would be destroyed. They would be the first victims of any such confrontation. The Iranian government, perhaps some elements there even would welcome this, because it would provide them with a perfect pretext to really securitize the atmosphere, put in martial law, and go after any political opponents. We've seen that happening in the past in Iran. In the region, the Iranians are unlikely to make any differentiation between the United States and Israel. There will be an assumption that Israel could not have made the attack without a tacit approval by the United States, in spite of the statements coming out of Admiral Mullen right now. So the retaliation would likely be against the United States, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, perhaps elsewhere. It is a truly disastrous situation, and what is almost comical about it is that there is also an admission by the military, including the Israeli military, that the likelihood of a successful military strike against Iran is very limited. At best, the program would not be destroyed. At best, it would be delayed 2 to 5 years. And 5 years later, the entire scenario would repeat itself. Now, what is then the likelihood that the Israelis would do such a thing? I think in the past, it's been more of a pressure tactic of getting the United States to keep the pressure on Iran and not deviate from the Israeli red line. The Israeli red line has been absolutely no enrichment in Iran, the zero enrichment objective. The Bush administration also had that as an objective. There's a lot of concern in Israel that the Obama administration will not adhere to that objective, but rather if they can find another compromise that would give Iran enrichment capabilities but wouldn't eliminate completely, but would nevertheless create significant problems for the Iranians to weaponize, that would be acceptable to the Obama administration. Whereas in Israel, that is still viewed as too big of a game changer in the region. But will the Israelis, as a result, nevertheless now take that action? I still find it rather unlikely, but you can't completely discount it. A couple of weeks ago, the Iranians did something that was very difficult to interpret. They took out the entire stockpile of low-enriched uranium, the low-enriched uranium that you would have to destroy if you want to set back their nuclear program. It's usually hidden underground, but now, for a couple of days, they put it outside of ground, in plain sight. There was articles about that. Is this even material that they have put a target on, almost welcoming Israel to bomb? Now, what was that done? Was it done because some elements in Iran might have wanted Israel to do this in order for them to be able to go after the Green Movement, wanting to have a small, limited military confrontation? Or was it done perhaps because they wanted to show the outside world that Israel is bluffing? Because if Israel wants to attack it, here it is. Go ahead. But because it wasn't an attack, then make the argument to China, make the argument to Russia, that when they come and put pressure on Iran and say you have to make a compromise on the nuclear issue, otherwise you will get sanctions, otherwise the Israelis may do something, the Iranians say no, because we put all the LEU out there and the Israelis didn't do anything. You can't use the Israeli argument as a pressure tactic because it was a bluff. It's difficult to say, but throughout the last 5 years there was not a single instance in which the LEU was put out above ground in plain sight.
One, how do you frame a human rights dialogue in a religious context, given in the government that has takes on a religious ideology? And secondly, can you give an example of a time when the U.S. has had a human rights dialogue with the country with that something has been achieved without a regime change?
So excellent questions, excellent questions. Well, first of all, you mentioned as a religious dialogue. There's a couple of things we should not forget when it comes to human rights. The question as you pose it almost gives the impression as this would be a foreign element coming to Iran because of their religious ideology. Well, reality is Iran is a signatory to numerous human rights conventions. It's also agreed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, there are some different interpretations when it comes to deeper layers of human rights theory. But when it comes to the issue of torture or killing or freedom of assembly, there's really no room for any particular difference of interpretation based on religious grounds. And Iran is a signatory to these conventions. As a result, Iran has an obligation to live up to these requirements, and the international community and the United States has an obligation to speak up when Iran doesn't. So this is not the interference of an imperial state going in and messing around with other states. The Iranians themselves have accepted these things. They have signed treaties accepting these things. And it is a matter that is driven primarily by elements in Iran itself. So I think the United States actually has a significant opportunities to be able to address these issues. And I would even go as far as to say that the Iranians are likely going to bring up human rights themselves, sensing that the United States might do so. The Iranian strategy is likely going to be one of offense. Instead of waiting for the United States to bring up what's happening in Iranian jails, the Iranians will themselves bring up what's happened in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. So the conversation will be there regardless. So I think we should not seek to avoid it, we should take it head on. We say constantly that Iran has obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Well, Iran also has obligations under numerous human rights conventions. They should be taken as seriously. Now, are there examples in which human rights successfully have been able to be changed without regime change? Well, I think the Helsinki process, though of course it did lead, contributed in some ways to regime change at the end, nevertheless saw some progress even prior to that. And also we have to ask ourselves, and how many examples can we really say that the international community led by the United States really did take human rights as seriously? So perhaps the number of examples we can look at are not that tremendously great, which to me is just another argument that it's about time that we start.
To what extent do you think oil plays as a factor in the geopolitical conflicts in the region?
Thank you. No, oil, of course, plays a very, very important role in numerous different ways. I mean, it's not just about oil, it's about natural gas, about energy security. These are important factors, without a doubt. But I wouldn't go as far as you sometimes see analysis in which essentially oil is made into the only variable that explains everything. I wouldn't be able to agree with that. But oil has been a critical factor in explaining Iran's growth and the amassment of power in Iran. But one of the factors that particularly in Washington we have not done a good job at is to understand how seriously the Iranians take soft power. We have focused very much on hard power. And we also focused a lot on Iranian hard power, which is essentially, you know, in spite of high oil prices at times and their weapons capabilities, really not comparable. Their primary strength has been in their usage of soft power, particularly vis-a-vis Israel and the United States. And that's actually one of the strategic reasons why hardliners in Iran are nervous about a U.S.-Iran dialogue, because they believe that their ability to be able to mobilize masses against the United States, or be able to define themselves as the anti-American power in the region, has been a tremendous asset for Iran in their calculation. And their fear is that if they negotiate with the United States and they strike a partnership with the United States, such as the one that Egypt did, their fear is that they would become a power that would be too tied to the United States, would be following U.S. policies too closely, would lose some of their independence, would not be able to speak up against some of those policies, and as a result they will undermine their long-term security in the region through a loss of soft power.
How do Iranian Americans view our relationship with Iran, the current regime in Iran, and the ongoing punching in the nose conflict with Israel and Iran?
Thank you. The Iranian American community overwhelmingly opposes the government in Iran. I think there's little doubt about that. A very large number of people who have made the United States their home precisely because of their differences with the government in Iran. When it comes to what to do, however, there are plenty of viewpoints. And there was greater clarity, I would argue, before the June elections. Before the June elections, numerous polls showed that the vast majority, 70+% of the community, favored diplomacy and engagement. A very large majority opposed economic sanctions, and this was particularly true for Iranian Americans who had been able to go back and forth between the countries, because if you do that, you can see that the sanctions have really impoverished the people, but have not had a particularly negative effect on the government. The government has always had a chance to be able to shift the burden of the sanctions onto populations, innocent people who have very little to do with this conflict. And of course, overwhelmingly opposed to a military confrontation between the two countries. After the June elections, for natural reasons, emotions were extremely high, and the polls I've seen show that opposition to war remained very, very strong. But support for diplomacy, for understandable reasons, went down. And support for sanctions in some areas went up, particularly when it comes to targeted sanctions. When it comes to broad-based sanctions, the type of sanctions that hit the entire economy, meaning they hit the people, I have not been able to see a lot of support. But targeted sanctions that hit the human rights abusers, that hit the people responsible for the decisions in Iran, support for that definitely does exist. But more than anything else, I would say there's no clarity right now. There's not been any particular viewpoint that have turned out to be dominant, because the situation is just too fluid. Whatever position you take now, it may be out of sync with reality a month later.
I have a lot of questions to ask, actually, but with respect to what you just said about this question of Iranian Americans, what would you say is the role of an Iranian American who wants to work for better relations with the U.S. And Iran while working towards improved human rights in Iran? I found that to be a conflicted role at times, and I really have asked lots of people this question. So what is the role of Iranian Americans that live in the U.S. who have the opportunity to lobby the Congress and I guess other ways? What would you say?
Thank you. I think it's a tremendously important question, because you put the two things into your question, making sure that you, on the one hand, can avoid a conflict, but on the other hand, make sure that human rights are not neglected. I think there's a couple of factors here that one needs to take a look at and analyze closer. There's always been this fear that if you negotiate with the government there, you would legitimize the government. And particularly after the elections, part of the growing number of people who still were a minority but nevertheless became concerned about any negotiations was because of the fear that they didn't want to see the United States negotiate in a manner that could strengthen Ahmadinejad or legitimize Ahmadinejad. What I think is important to keep in mind, though, is that the type of legitimacy that the Iranian government lacks is not the international legitimacy. It's the internal, domestic legitimacy. They have lost legitimacy in the eyes of their own people. And that means that even if the United States were to negotiate with them, it doesn't lend them the legitimacy that they're lacking, because it's only the people of Iran that can legitimize the government of Iran. If the Iranians were to come in 2000 and come up with a solution on how to resolve indecision 2000, Bush versus Gore, how legitimate would that be in the eyes of the American people? It would be completely illegitimate. This is a legitimacy that the source of it is solely the people of Iran. So I think it's important to understand that, not to go too far with the legitimacy argument, or not to apply it in an incorrect way. I think there are legitimate fears in which a recognition of Ahmadinejad, particularly prematurely, could have an impact in swaying power and influence his way. But legitimacy does not come from that. At the end of the day, the legitimacy problem that Ahmadinejad has would have remained regardless of what happened in the negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. I would say that, particularly when it comes to an effort to be able to prevent war, but make sure that human rights is not sacrificed in a negotiation, requires a constituency to exist that would push for that specific line. I can tell you that right now, it is not my belief, sitting in Washington, that there is a strong constituency that is pushing for that. There is very strong constituencies that have managed for the last couple of years to turn Iran into one single issue country, and that issue is the nuclear issue. All other issues more or less do not exist when you talk about Iran. You solely view Iran through that prism, and we forget about human rights. For that to be balanced, there needs to be interest groups, there needs to be constituencies that raise that argument that in the long run, even if you manage to get a short-term nuclear deal, if you get it at the expense of losing the soft power that the United States has, the positive views that the Iranian people have currently about the United States, you have only set yourself up for a bigger problem than we currently have. Because at the end of the day, Iran is very unique in the Middle East. Whereas in many Arab countries, you have very low numbers supporting or having a positive view of the United States. I think there were some polls made back in 2003, 2004, in which, for instance, in Indonesia, one of the biggest Muslim country, support for the United States was only about 11% or so. This is before the tsunami, though, in which it did go up. Turkey, a major American ally, 13%. Jordan, a whopping 3%. And these are incidentally countries who all have very strong relations with the United States. Iran is the opposite. You don't have a strong relationship with the United States, but miraculously, by coincidence, the Iranian people tend to have a very positive view of the United States. That's an asset, a strategic asset that is extremely difficult to build, extremely easy to lose. And if we make a deal that comes at the expense of this, and we manage to be able to reduce the nuclear threat, but we win a 70 million population as enemies, I'm not so sure if that calculation really makes a lot of sense. But that calculation will not even be regarded, will not even be considered unless there are elements who make this a point. And the Iranian American community has the work cut out for them to, as citizens of the United States, as contributors to this society, be active and present those viewpoints.
Let's say I am going to remove Iran on the surface of the earth. What does it mean?
Sorry, remove Iran from?
On the surface of the earth. If I say I don't like Iran, it's one of the world, tropical country in the world. What does it mean to you?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand the question. If someone were to remove Iran from the surface of the earth, okay.
What does it mean to you?
I wouldn't really know. But if you're saying that, if I can reinterpret your question, and you're making the argument that Iran is faced with that type of a threat, or could you elaborate the question? I'm trying to find a good angle to.
You're saying that's what Ahmadinejad is saying about Israel.
Oh, okay.
How do Iranians deal if someone...
Oh, I see. Okay, now I fully understand. Okay, I think that's a great question. I think the Iranians would take that extremely negatively, and I think the Israelis are quite justified in being absolutely outraged by much of the rhetoric that is coming out of Ahmadinejad, in particular Ahmadinejad. And I think even more so, to be completely frank, mindful of the fact that the statement that has been interpreted as wiping Israel off the map was not said so in Persian. Actually, what he was saying at that moment was that the Zionist entity will evaporate from the pages of time, essentially predicting that the Zionist experiment would not be a long-lasting one, similarly to the fact that others have predicted that the Islamic Republic will not last forever. That is less so, I think, in the mindset of many Israelis, offensive compared to the fact that he has questioned the Holocaust in the way that he repeatedly has, without any interpretation problems. He's been quite clear in the way that he's done so. And he has truly, in that sense, been very, very effective in reinforcing the ideological framing and reinforcing elements inside of Israel who, as a result of this rhetoric, have drawn the conclusion that there is no way that anything good can come out of this, and that they're essentially preparing themselves for a confrontation. It really shows that rhetoric can be tremendously, tremendously dangerous. What is the most dangerous when you take all the rhetoric at face value and you don't look beyond it.
One of the things that you brought out very beautifully in that book, something I hadn't really thought about, is the real power dynamic that exists in this country between the very strong lobby that Israel has, presence against, as opposed to almost no presence at all of an Iranian comparable power. And so when you look at that dynamic, how do we get around it? How are we ever going to get around it?
It's an interesting question you say, because Washington is at times looking very much like a replica of the entire world stage. And many different elements have their representations. And if you have a good, strong lobby there, it may actually be more valuable than having a big army. But at the end of the day, this is the sad part of it. The United States, let me put it this way, one person said that they recognize that this is not a helpful policy, but it's not hurtful enough. At some point it will be so hurtful, it will create so many problems, so many contradictions, that it will not be sustainable. I personally believe that we have come very, very close to that. There is a very different atmosphere in Washington right now than it was just a couple of years ago. There are recognitions leaked out of the Obama administration of things that in the past was very difficult to articulate in Washington, such as the fact that General Petraeus has hinted that there is some sort of a relationship between how America is viewed in the region and what happens in Israel and Palestine. This is obvious to most people, but in Israel that has not necessarily been an accepted view. But when you have now General Petraeus say this, you have other people in the government saying, you're seeing that there's changes in the political landscape that are taking place. Nothing happens by itself, though. You have elements either pushing for it, or you have necessity forcing reality, even on politicians.
Is it clear at all who really controls the nuclear program in Iran? And are there legitimate civilian reasons for Iran developing nuclear reactors?
Again, as I mentioned earlier on, it's very, very difficult to tell. The Iranians have done a pretty decent job, it seems, to keep the world confused, and by that also raise suspicions. We have seen in the last couple of months news stories that seem to indicate that the U.S. intelligence has had a couple of coups, a couple of victories in which people from the nuclear program have been able to be won over, defect, and are giving information. But based on the news stories, it actually also gives the impression that these stories would not have been leaked had the utility of those assets not been exhausted, meaning that they probably weren't terribly, terribly helpful at the end of the day. But as to the question, is there any justification for a nuclear program? It depends on from which perspective. If you talk about a weapons program, I personally think absolutely not. I think it actually is a tremendously negative development for Iran to get nuclear weapons, and that it would be a strategic detriment to Iran to have it rather than an asset. When it comes to having a nuclear energy program and having the energy security of being able to produce your own fuel for those reactors, it doesn't seem to make a lot of economic sense. But you tell me which government acts in a way that makes a lot of economic sense. I would put France's agricultural industry on top of the list, and that's one of the countries that have been using the lack of economic rationale for Iran's nuclear program as a cause of concern. If that's true, there's a lot of concern with almost everything happening in France. But what you see, though, is when you look at it from the perspective of energy security, it does seem to make some sense. And reality is that this is a program that was started during the Shah's reign in Iran back in the 1970s. And back then, there were two gentlemen who were quite active in convincing the Shah of Iran that even though Iran's population was almost half of what it is today, and even though Iran was consuming much less of its old energy, its own oil reserves, and actually was producing more oil than it is producing today, those two gentlemen, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, convinced the Shah of Iran that he needed to have a nuclear program and that he needed to be able to enrich uranium. And the Iranians, till this day, seem to be adamant about maintaining or being able to control that program because they don't want to be in a situation in which they today are energy exporters. They're not addicted to anyone else's oil. But in the future, once the oil runs out, after having been an energy exporter in which 85% of your state budget comes from that energy export, you suddenly lose it entirely. Instead, its strategy is to then turn Iran into an energy exporter of nuclear energy. And for you to be able to do that effectively, you need to be able to produce, you need to control almost every aspect of that cycle. So from that perspective, long-term vision, it certainly does make sense. And I'm sure you also noticed that the argument that Iran has oil, hence it should not have this, was something that was used 5-6 years ago, but is less repeated these days, because it was a fundamentally flawed argument. But it does not mean that the international community does not have legitimate concerns about the Iranian program, that there are not suspicious activities, that there isn't lack of transparency, and that there isn't a significant risk that nevertheless something wrong could happen. So I think we are absolutely right in insisting on transparency, and I think the best way would actually be to get to a situation, which I happen to believe is doable, in which the Iranians would implement, ratify the additional protocol and perhaps a couple of steps beyond that, because that would give us tremendous insights and transparency into the program that would give us a much better sensitivity to understand quickly, time sensitivity, if anything fishy is happening in that program. Right now, if the Iranians were to change the configuration of centrifuges at Natanz, it could take the IAEA between 30 to 90 days before they would discover it. If the additional protocol was implemented and you had the 24-hour cameras there, it would take less than 24 hours to figure out that something is happening that shouldn't be happening. And that makes it very, very difficult for the Iranians to be able to use a civilian program in order to be able to get close to a bomb. It's very valuable. The problem is that it's called inspections and verification, and in Washington, we don't have a lot of confidence in those type of solutions, even though those solutions have turned out to be more effective. One last?
I'm going to say the last question here. We're closing in on 8:30. You may linger at the front for a few minutes if you really, really want to grab it, especially if you have a book autograph.
In the opposition between Iran and Israel for influence of the United States, and this equation set up where Iran had good reason to oppose the peace process, because to the extent that it succeeded, it would undermine ISIS. Why it surprises me then that Israel would not take more seriously and strategically solving the Palestinian problem, as opposed to what appears to be a very ideological approach to the problem.
What you're mentioning there is something that many people in Israel, particularly those a little bit more on the left, would agree with. But if I were to try to explain to you my understanding of the many, many people in Israel that I interviewed that are currently in the Israeli government on the right, there isn't any confidence whatsoever. They don't believe that a real peace with the Palestinians or the Arabs is achievable. And they believe that by expanding the territory and creating more buffer for Israel, that is the only thing that enhances their security, because they have an inherently negative view of any prospects of finding a true peace with the surrounding Arab states. And this is partly, not necessarily wholly, what is driving them, in which it, in my view, has put a tremendous amount of burden on the Israeli state, because it's a state then who, unlike other states, does not seek to manage threats, but rather seeks to eliminate them. That's a significant difference. When you try to eliminate threats, you put a very, very high bar on yourself, and your defense expenditure and everything else that you do is completely securitized. Whereas even the United States, as a superpower, have after 8 years come to learn that that's simply not a possibility. You have to manage threats. We live in a world in which insecurity, unfortunately, is prevalent, and you have to manage that insecurity rather than seeking to completely eliminate it, particularly if you try to eliminate it by force, because that's a contradiction in terms. Thank you so much.